Disclaimer. Bloody Mary is a legend that is known to mention blood in the name and in the story. If you are uncomfortable with the sight of blood or the mentioning of blood, then tread carefully. Any footages or images I use are of fake blood. Almost everyone has heard of Bloody Mary. The stories of her legend vary depending on region of the world or who whispers her name, and they are not wrong. Many Marys have met terrible demises, their fates ending with tragedy, tears, and blood. This story of Bloody Mary comes from Indiana, one that is sad and full of heartache. She's just one of the many Bloody Marys. Sometime during the 19th century lived a farmer named Joseph Wales. He had an income from catching and selling runaway slaves before the Civil War. He loved his evil job, but what he loved more was his beautiful wife Virginia. He was a cruel man. After catching runaway slaves, he would chain them up in the cellar until he could collect the reward. And when slaves would become rare, he would catch free men and sell them into slavery instead. No one is quite sure why, but Virginia feared her husband. We can assume it was due to alcoholism and abuse, with later mentioning what he did to Mary. After the Civil War, Mr. Wales' income fell, leaving him penniless. Not too soon after, his wife passed away during childbirth to a beautiful little girl named Mary. After this, Mr. Wales was grief-stricken and scarred with depression. He allowed his business to completely die and his farm to become overwhelmed with weeds. His home and barn fell into disrepair. Joseph hated his little girl, but kept her alive because she was his last link to his deceased wife. He fed her, though not well, and dressed her in rags. He managed to recover himself to make a meager living from his farm. Mary was a cute little girl. Hair long and tangled, was said to be blonde and curly. She did not go to school with other children, and no one ever heard her speak. It is said she liked to read and was forced to do majority of the chores around the house and farm. As she grew up into a young woman, she looked more and more like her mother. This is when Joseph began to drink excessively. Joseph couldn't take it anymore. One night while drunk, Joseph snuck into Mary's room where she slept. He watched her for a moment, taking in the characteristics of his wife while remembering her death, and then he took a knife and started slashing at her. Mary woke up screaming and thrashed about to defend herself, but bits of torn flesh littered the bed and the floor instead. It didn't take long for Mary to pass. Now this is where the story varies. In one, he left her in her room, and in the morning, after his brain was slightly clearer, he carried her body down to the cellar where he gave her a shallow grave. He shed no tears for her, left no stone to mark her grave, and he wanted to forget about her. In the other, he brought her to the basement that night and gave her a shallow grave as well. Both versions, he was haunted by his daughter's spirit, where she plagued her father for days, before he ultimately hung himself in the barn. Here is a more descriptive version of the tale, but disclaimer, this is a little graphic. A couple of nights after burying her body, Mr. Wells returned from his nightly chores to find Mary standing in the kitchen. Her head was lolling against one shoulder from a slit that nearly severed it. A pool of blood sits at her feet, and serrated knife marks break her beautiful face. Mr. Wales screamed and rushed out the kitchen door, glancing over his shoulder as he does, only to find her gone. A week has passed. While Mr. Wales was reading the newspaper, he had a sense someone was watching him. He looked up from the paper to find Mary sitting in the chair opposite of him, her dress cut and slathered in blood. Her beaten hands were knitting a shirt as she watched him through scorned eyes. The sound of blood dripping filled the room. Mr. Wales dropped his newspaper and fled the house in panic. As he ran, he felt 2 deep cuts run across his back. After this, Mr. Wales slept in the barn for several days, too afraid to return to his house. After a week of sleeping in the hay and eating raw food from the garden, he decided to return to his house believing the spirit must be gone. Mr. Wales was desperate to bathe. He went to the bathroom to begin shaving his face, and while he shaved, he saw the glowing red eyes of Mary. This time her lips were split down the center, and blood dripped from her mouth. She reached for him. her nails like claws as they came from the mirror and slashed against his partially shaven cheek. He dropped his knife and ran from the house to the safety of his barn. But he was no longer safe there either. He heard her calling him. He turned to find her standing in the barn with him with a smile on her bloody face. She pointed to a noose hanging from the rafters, and feeling as if the rope was calling for him, he went up the ladder and hung himself. This was just one tale of the legend of Mary Wales. All tales have her being killed by her father, and her father hanging himself in the end. Joseph wasn't found until weeks later by neighbors who tried to return cattle that had wandered away. When they entered the house, they found the shallow grave of the decomposing body of Mary Wales. They then found a suicide letter on the kitchen table where Joseph admitted to his crime of killing his daughter. Stories circulated that Mary's ghost lingers on the land, and those who trespass on the property will find mysterious scratches on their faces and arms. In 1940, the farm was burned down, and in 1950, a local farmer purchased the property. He started to build where the old foundation was, but it was tainted with bad luck. The new house had many problems, everywhere from the floors, roof, to the electricity system, which caused a fire one night and almost killed the family. Even after the repairs, the bad luck continued. One of the farmer's children was seriously injured in a car accident, and then the farmer and his wife went through a terrible divorce. I couldn't find the location of the farm or its land, but from what Weird Indiana says, the farmhouse has fell apart as time passed and became a local haunted house. In 1940, the house burned down, and authorities blamed it on local teens. However, rumors say it was Mary who destroyed it. After the land was rebuilt on by the local farmer, who in the end abandoned the place due to dire bad luck, the remaining structures were torn down in the mid-1980s. It is said that Mary's body was taken from the cellar after being found and buried in an unmarked grave in a nearby cemetery. This location was a quiet graveyard up until this point, where people started saying it was haunted as well. Visitors claim that they received scratches and cuts while visiting the graveyard. Normally I would dig deep into any case, but this one has me sitting still with my thumb up my bum. Why so graphic, Amanda? Well, I couldn't find the town or location of where Joseph Wales and Mary Wales lived. I tried looking up their names, but I couldn't find anything from the 19th century. I received this case at random by flipping through my many books and landing on Weird Indiana. But even the articles didn't have any location, which is weird for a Weird State book. Hell, I even tried looking up Bloody Mary in Indiana and got the drinks instead. Yes, the Bloody Mary drinks instead. Watch, after this video, a whole bunch of information will be found by you fellow researchers. And if you do find anything, please send it my way. Do I believe there was a Mary Wales? It is possible. Do I think she's Bloody Mary type of spirit? No. She obviously resides in the location her body has been placed, which is normal for a spirit. Bloody Mary is sort of a curse you put on yourself when you want to be daring, but from what I was able to read, which wasn't much on this particular woman, she remains at her location and haunts that location. I hope you enjoy. If you'd like to support me, check out my Patreon page. I create videos on cryptids, abductions, serious killers, hauntings, and much more. I'd also like to thank my supporting Patreon thus far. If you can't support me this way, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm also putting up my PayPal account out of request for those who can't do monthly transactions who still want to support this channel.